Now listen here family, you know Auntie May has lived long enough to see good men go bad, bad men go broke, and proud folks fall right off the ladder they climbed on somebody else's back. And when this child came to me with her story, I said, Lord have mercy, because what she lived through was not just betrayal, it was revelation. And sometimes revelation hurts, but it also frees you. So sit down, grab your tea and open your heart, because this story will teach you 6 things. 6 truths, 6 reminders, 6 stepping stones, to walk you right out of hurt and straight into healing. Here we go. When a woman has lived long enough to see storms come and go, she begins to understand that some storms do not arrive with thunder or lightning at all. Some arrive in the form of someone you once trusted raising his voice at you and telling you that you are no longer needed. That is the kind of storm that tears through the inside of your chest and leaves everything feeling hollow and shaky. That is exactly what happened the morning my husband looked at me with that new kind of smugness in his eyes, the kind that only shows up when someone believes he is suddenly above the life he built. That morning began like any other. I rose before the sun, I made my tea, I listened to the old clock tick on the wall. I thought I knew the rhythm of my home, I thought I knew the rhythm of my marriage, but life has a funny way of shifting under your feet without warning. I was standing at the kitchen counter stirring my tea when he walked in, and I could tell something was different. He carried himself like a man who had been handed a crown and had forgotten where he came from. His shoulders were too far back, his chin was too high, his smile was not a smile at all but a smirk. I asked him gently what was going on, and instead of answering he tossed a large envelope onto the table and said, open it. I did not rush, I did not panic, I simply picked it up, knowing full well that anything delivered with that kind of attitude was not going to bring me peace. I opened the envelope, and inside there were papers, thick papers, heavy papers, the kind that only involve big decisions and big money. Before I could even make sense of them, he leaned back against the counter, folded his arms and said, I do not need you anymore, I am rich now. When I tell you my knees nearly gave out, I mean it. I looked at him hoping he would laugh and say it was a joke, or tell me he was angry about something else, or even admit he was confused, but no, his eyes held none of the softness I once knew. Instead they held greed and pride and something far darker. He said that his grandmother finally passed and left him a large inheritance, and that he had been waiting for this moment for years. I felt the room tilt a little as he told me how he no longer needed the life we had built together. He said it like we were discussing a tool he no longer used, not a marriage we had committed to with open hearts. I asked him why he was saying such cruel things, and he shrugged and said he could finally live the life he deserved. He said he could buy new things, travel, do whatever he wanted, and that dragging me along would only slow him down. I stood there with my tea growing cold in my hand, and all I could think was, this is the man I shared my meals with, my dreams with, my fears with. This is the man who once held my hands and promised we would grow old together. But something had poisoned his mind, and that poison was money, sudden money, money that did not come from his hard work but from someone else's passing. He looked at me as though I were nothing more than a piece of furniture he planned to throw to the curb, and he said, pack your things and be gone. By noon he did not raise his voice, he did not slam his fist, he did not even look angry. He was calm, too calm, the kind of calm people get when they think they have won a game you did not even know you were playing. I wanted to shout, I wanted to cry, I wanted to ask him how he could forget everything we shared, but I knew none of that would reach him anymore. So instead I took a deep breath, set my tea down and walked to the bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. I saw our wedding photo on the dresser, the one where we stood on the hill with the wind blowing through our hair and joy lighting up our faces. I picked it up, and for a moment I felt a sting in my chest as I remembered how hopeful I once felt. I placed it face down because I could not look at it anymore. I packed slowly, not because I wanted to take my time but because I wanted to understand what was happening. My heart was breaking, but I tried to gather it into something I could carry with me. When noon approached I walked out with my small suitcase, and he did not even walk me to the door, he just nodded as if dismissing someone from a job. When I stepped outside I looked back and saw him already on the phone, smiling, laughing, discussing purchases and plans and things he never once talked about with me. I felt like a ghost in the life I helped create. I walked down the driveway feeling the weight of betrayal settling inside me. There is no pain quite like being told you are no longer needed by the person who once claimed he loved you. I stopped at the end of the street and felt the air on my face, and for a moment I wondered what would happen next. Where would I go? How would I start over at this age? What would become of me? I reached into my bag searching for tissues when my fingers brushed something small and stiff. It was my father's old card tucked into the pocket of my wallet. I had kept it for years, not for money but as a keepsake, a piece of him I carried everywhere. I pulled it out and stared at it, remembering the quiet strength my father always had, the way he would tell me, "Daughter, life will throw you from the nest when you least expect it, but you will fly, you will always fly." I held that card and something inside me shifted, not quickly, not dramatically, but enough for me to straighten my back, wipe my eyes and take a step forward. I told myself that the man who kicked me out was not the measure of my worth, and that maybe, just maybe, my father's card would be the beginning of something new. I walked toward the bus stop, knowing I had no home to return to, but also knowing that the story was far from over. Little did I know that using that old card would send the bank into panic and unravel a secret that would change everything. When I stepped out of that house with nothing but the clothes on my back and the weight of what had just happened pressing on my chest, I felt a hollowness I had never known before. It was the kind of emptiness that comes when the person you trusted the most looks at you and tells you that your value, your time, your love, your presence, all of it has expired. I walked down that front path with shaking hands and a pounding heart, trying to understand how a marriage that had lasted so many years could be tossed aside so easily and so loudly. The words "I do not need you anymore, I am rich now" kept ringing in my head like a cruel echo that would not fade. My steps felt heavy, yet I kept moving because standing there would have broken me even more. I reached the sidewalk and stopped for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My chest felt tight, like the air around me had thickened. I tried to steady myself, but the pain inside me swirled like a storm that refused to calm. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The shock on my face. The smugness on his. The way he pointed toward the door as if it were a blessing to be allowed to leave. As I kept walking, I found myself drifting through memories without meaning to. Memories of the way he once held my hand with gentleness. Memories of nights we stayed up talking about our future. Memories of promises that suddenly felt like cheap words tossed into the wind. It was like watching a slideshow of a life that no longer belonged to me. I had given him years of loyalty, faith, compassion and effort. I had supported him through mistakes and worries and failures. I had tried to be the partner he needed even when I felt unseen. Now it seemed none of that mattered. Wealth had entered the picture, and the man I thought I knew had revealed a side that stunned me. I kept thinking how quickly money can twist a person's spirit when their heart is weak. Wealth does not create cruelty, but it exposes it. It does not build character, but it magnifies whatever is already there. In his case, it emboldened selfishness. It inflated arrogance. It told him he did not need kindness or partnership or shared dreams. He only needed power and independence and the ability to show off to people who barely cared about him. What I witnessed in him that morning was not confidence. It was hunger for approval. A hunger so deep that it made him discard the one person who actually loved him. I turned the corner and kept walking, guided by nothing but fear and instinct. I had no plan, no destination, no belongings. I felt stripped of everything, even my identity. For so many years I had been a wife, a partner, a supporter. Now I was simply a woman standing alone with shattered trust and a hurting soul. But the longer I walked, the more something surprising began to form in me. A tiny spark, a quiet whisper, a thought so fragile I almost missed it. You survived this far, you will survive what comes next. I did not know where the thought came from, yet it settled into me like a little flame refusing to go out. I kept walking, letting that thought guide my steps. The sunlight shifted across the pavement and the air slowly cooled as the day moved forward. I passed strangers who had no idea what I was carrying in my heart. People went about their routines with cups of coffee, phones in their hands, conversations filling the air. Life was continuing all around me, and somehow that made me feel less alone. I reached a small bench near the park and finally let myself sit. My legs ached and my shoulders sagged with exhaustion. I folded my hands and stared at the ground, letting the silence wash over me. After a long moment I lifted my head and watched the world around me. Children running, birds hopping near the grass, a woman pushing a stroller, a man reading the morning news. Life did not pause for heartbreak. It never does. As I sat there, the spark inside me grew a little. Not enough to erase the pain, but enough to remind me that the story was not over. There was still a long road ahead. A road I did not choose, but one I would walk anyway. I told myself that survival does not always begin with strength. Sometimes it begins with loss. Pain pushes you forward when comfort would have kept you stuck. While I was deep in thought, another memory surfaced. My father, the man who taught me resilience. The man who believed in preparing for storms even when the sky looked clear. I remembered how he used to say that life will surprise you in the worst ways, but if you build a strong spirit you will rise even during the darkest moments. That memory was like a warm blanket around my trembling soul. My father had passed years ago, but something in me felt pulled toward his memory with unusual force. It was not grief or longing. It was almost like guidance. A reminder that he had left something behind, something I had forgotten. My mind sifted through old feelings, old memories, old belongings, and then it landed on the thought that had been buried under time and sorrow. My father's old card, the one he told me never to use unless I had nowhere else to turn. A shiver ran through me as I remembered it. I had tucked it away so long ago that I had almost convinced myself it did not matter. But now as I sat there on that bench alone and hurt and directionless, that card came back into my mind like a clear instruction. It felt like my father's voice whispering that I still had a lifeline. I stood up slowly, realizing that my next step was already chosen for me. I did not know what was on the card or whether it still held anything at all. I did not even know if it was truly meant for a moment as heavy as this. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I could not stay lost. I could not stay broken. I could not let my husband's cruelty define the rest of my life. With a steadying breath I began walking again, this time with intention. I felt a new sense of direction building within me. The world around me no longer looked blurry. The betrayal no longer felt like the end. It felt like the beginning of something unexpected, something my father might have prepared me for without me realizing it. Each step carried a growing sense of determination. I would not crawl. I would not beg. I would not let heartbreak silence me. I would take that card and face whatever came next, even if I had to fake courage along the way. As I headed toward the bus stop, my heart still ached, but it no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar in the making, a mark of survival, a mark of transformation. The words spoken to me earlier, "I do not need you anymore, I am rich now," were still painful, but they no longer held the same power. They no longer defined me. They no longer shaped the direction of my spirit. I whispered to myself as I walked, "I will rebuild. I will recover. And I will discover who I can become without the weight of someone who never deserved me." And with that I stepped forward into the next chapter, ready to uncover whatever waited at the end of my father's forgotten lifeline. When I walked out of that house with nothing but my shaking breath and the clothes on my back, I felt like a woman who had been pushed off a cliff and was still waiting to hit the ground. The evening air felt colder than it should have, and I could not tell if it was the wind or the shock running through me. My husband had just told me that he did not need me anymore because he was rich now, and those words kept echoing in my ears like some cruel chant. I did not understand how a man I had spent years supporting through his darkness could smile at me like I was a burden he had finally managed to scrape off of his shoe. I kept walking and I did not know where I was going, but I knew I had to move because standing still felt like drowning. At some point I found myself sitting on a bench outside a small store, watching the lights flicker as cars passed by. My mind was going in circles trying to make sense of what had happened, and my heart felt bruised in ways I could not name. I kept thinking about all the years I had cooked for him and prayed for him and stood by him when he had nothing. I kept thinking about the nights I held him when he cried over bills and the mornings I encouraged him when he felt like giving up. And now, after receiving an inheritance that he never earned and never expected, he felt powerful enough to throw me out like an old coat he no longer needed. There was a part of me that wanted to scream, and there was another part that felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides with a spoon. As I sat there I began to realize something I had never allowed myself to see before. This moment was not created in a single evening. It had been growing for years in small ways that I had ignored because I believed love required patience and forgiveness. I remember the first time he said something sharp and I told myself he was stressed. I remembered the first time he dismissed my opinion and I convinced myself it was not important. I remembered the first time he called me names when he was angry and I excused it because he apologized later. And now I was staring at the final result of every time I had swallowed my pain to keep peace in a house that never fully respected me. The truth hit me gently but firmly. This was the first time he was honest with me. Wealth had stripped away his mask and I was seeing the man he had always been underneath it. That realization hurt more than his words, but it also woke up a small spark of strength deep inside me. A spark I had forgotten I possessed. I sat up straighter on that bench and looked around at the world moving as if nothing significant had happened. People were walking into the store, buying snacks, laughing or talking on their phones, while my entire life felt like it had been shaken like a snow globe. But life does not stop when your heart breaks. It keeps going, and eventually you must choose to stand up and go with it. I took a deep breath and told myself that if he could throw me out so easily, then maybe I did not lose a husband. Maybe I lost a burden. It was a strange thought, but it held me steady. I decided I was not going to sit in that cold all night like a forgotten woman. I was going to take one small step forward and trust that the path would reveal itself as I walked. I started moving again, not sure where my feet were carrying me, until I found myself standing near a small hotel that looked simple but safe. I walked inside and spoke to the woman at the front desk, who looked at me with the kind of softness only women who have survived their own storms possess. She gave me a room with no questions asked, even though she kept glancing at my face as if she could see the weight I was carrying. When I got inside the room, I sank onto the bed and every emotion that had been bottled up inside me burst open. I cried in a way I had not cried in years. Not the soft, quiet cries that you push into a pillow so no one hears them, but the deep, painful kind that shake your whole chest. The kind that feel like your soul squeezing out every drop of hurt it had been holding. I cried until I felt empty, and once the tears dried I felt strangely lighter. My heart was still bruised, but the heaviness had shifted. After I washed my face, I sat on the edge of the bed thinking about what to do next. I had no home, no money, no plan, and no one to call. But instead of panicking, I sat there breathing slowly and letting my mind settle. And in that quiet moment an unexpected memory surfaced. I thought of my father. A man who taught me to be calm in chaos because panic never saved anyone. A man who always told me that strength is not loud and forceful. Strength is silent and steady. I could almost hear his voice in that room telling me to stand up and face forward. And as I sat there with my hands in my lap, a feeling washed over me that I was not as alone as I thought. My father may have been gone, but something of him lived inside me. Something steady, something wise, something resilient. A strange sense of determination grew in my chest. I decided that this terrible night would not be the one to define me. I would not let my husband's cruelty dictate my future. I would not let this moment break me. Instead, I would let it push me towards something new, even if I did not yet know what that new thing would be. I stood up slowly, walked to the window and looked at the dark sky. And in that quiet stillness I made myself a promise. I would not go back begging for the place he stole from me. If he believed his new wealth made him powerful, he was about to learn something important. Real power is not in money. Real power is in endurance. Real power is in knowing how to rebuild yourself when the world knocks you flat. Real power is in rising without needing anyone to catch you. I climbed into bed and let sleep take me, and for the first time in a long time I felt a small flicker of hope glowing in the center of my chest. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this much. Tonight I survived humiliation, heartbreak, betrayal, and fear. And if I could survive tonight, then I could survive whatever came next. The morning after everything fell apart felt like waking up in a world that did not belong to me, because nothing looked familiar and nothing felt steady under my feet, but I kept moving, because when life throws you into the cold you can either sit there and freeze or you can get up and build your own fire, and I had spent too many years letting someone else hold the matches, and now I knew I had to learn to strike my own. I woke up on that borrowed couch with my body aching and my heart stinging, but something inside me felt sharper and stronger, like a voice finally rising after being silent for too long, and that voice said, "You will not stay down." So I got myself together, brushed my hair as best I could, and stepped out into the morning air that felt like a reminder that the world was still turning and I had every right to turn with it. As I walked I kept hearing my husband's last words echo in my mind like a cruel bell ringing over and over: "I do not need you anymore, I am rich now." And every time those words replayed in my thoughts I felt something inside me tighten, not with sadness but with a determination that surprised even me, and I thought to myself, well, if he does not need me, then maybe that is the best thing that ever happened, because maybe I can finally figure out what I need. I had no plan, no clear path, no home to go back to and no hand to hold, but I had my name, my dignity, and the strength that comes from being pushed so hard you finally stand straighter. And I walked toward the bank because I knew that the inheritance mess needed sorting and I was done letting him control the narrative of my life. When I stepped inside the bank, the cool air hit my face and I felt a little jolt of nerves ripple through me because this place held answers and truths, and I had spent so long letting my husband handle every bill, every form, every detail that I felt like a stranger entering a world he never wanted me to understand. But I walked up to the counter anyway, and the young man behind the glass looked at me like he sensed something wounded but strong in me, and he said softly, "How may I help you today, ma'am?" And I told him that I needed to speak to someone private about an inheritance issue, and the moment I said that word inheritance, his eyes changed just slightly, not with judgment but with alertness, like he knew this was important. He brought out a woman who carried herself with the authority of someone who had seen all kinds of human trouble across her desk, and she invited me into her office and asked me to tell her everything, and I took a deep breath and let the story pour out before I even had time to censor it. I told her how my husband changed overnight after the inheritance, how he shoved me out like I was furniture he no longer needed, how he gloated about his newfound riches, how he acted like decades of marriage meant nothing, and how I had been left with nowhere to land except with the hope that maybe the inheritance was not as one-sided as he claimed. She listened with an expression that never shifted from stern empathy, and when I finished she leaned back and folded her hands and said something that made my whole body go still, because she told me there were accounts tied to my father's name and tied to mine, and that my husband had tried to access them without authorization. Hearing that felt like a rush of heat rising through my chest, because suddenly everything made sense: his panic, his sudden cruelty, his determination to get rid of me once he thought he was set for life. He never saw me as a partner, he saw me as an obstacle blocking his hand from grabbing every dollar he thought he deserved, and I sat in that office with the weight of years pressing down as I realized how blind I had been to the greed growing in him like weeds choking a garden. But mixed with the hurt was something new, a strength ready to bloom. Because for the first time I saw clearly that I had the power to stop him, and I had the right to step into the financial world he always told me was too complicated for me, because that was a lie meant to keep me small and lost. The banker showed me documents that made my stomach twist, because they showed his attempts to forge signatures and move money and even close accounts in secret, and each page felt like another knife cutting away the illusion of the man I thought I had married. And then that banker looked at me with firm, steady eyes and said, "You can fight this, you are not helpless," and I felt something inside me shift like an old door unlocking after years of rust. That moment was when I felt the first spark of real power in my chest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and rising, and I knew I could no longer see myself as someone tossed aside, because I was someone with legal rights and with a claim to my own life and my own inheritance. Walking out of that bank I felt taller than when I walked in, and the sunlight felt different on my face, like it was warming a part of me that had been cold far too long. I thought about my husband sitting in our house, so sure of himself, so confident that he had won, and for the first time I felt no desire to shrink, no desire to cry, no desire to beg. I felt ready to stand up, ready to claim what was mine, ready to let him feel the shock of learning that the woman he dismissed was not gone, not broken, not drowned. She was rising, and sometimes the rise of a woman is the most frightening thing a selfish man can witness. I carried that strength with me all the way back to the borrowed couch where I was staying, and instead of collapsing into my usual sadness, I sat down calmly and started planning, because survival is one thing, but reclaiming your life is something greater, and I knew this was the beginning of that climb. And the more I thought about the years behind me, all the patience, all the silent tears, all the sacrifices, the more I realized that this moment right here was not punishment, it was liberation disguised as heartbreak. Life had not ended, life had begun again. And as I looked out the window at the world moving on, cars rushing, people passing, birds flying through the wide sky, I whispered to myself the words I had forgotten to believe in for a very long time: I am not done. Not even close. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that felt like a stone pressing deep inside my heart, yet there was also a strange stillness in the air around me, almost like life itself was holding its breath to watch what I would do next, because the night before I had cried until I could not breathe, but at dawn I felt something new inside me, a kind of strength that did not shout but whispered, "Stand up, child, stand up and let the world see what you are made of, because a woman does not crumble forever. She may bend, she may shake, she may fall for a moment, but she will always rise rise again, and that thought carried me forward as I pulled myself off that thin mattress in the shelter and walked toward the small mirror hanging crooked on the wall, and when I looked at my reflection I barely recognized the woman staring back at me because she looked tired and bruised and pushed aside, yet there was a glow in her eyes, a spark that came from deep within, because pain can crush you but it can also sharpen you, and that sharpened part of me had been asleep for years while I spent my life shrinking myself to keep my husband comfortable and quiet and satisfied, and now that he had cast me away thinking he no longer needed me, now that he believed he stood tall on his inheritance and his new sense of power, something inside me began to wake and stretch like a long sleeping lion stretching its legs, ready to move again, ready to reclaim its place in the world. I left the shelter and walked through the morning light feeling a sense of purpose building with every step, and though I had nothing in my pockets, not a single bill or a key or anything else that belonged to me, I did have one thing that no one could take, strength that had been hidden beneath years of silence and fear, and now it was rising like the sun, lifting the darkness inch by inch, and I knew deep in my bones that my story was not finished, not even close, because my husband thought the inheritance gave him wings, but he did not realize it gave me wings too, wings made not of money but of clarity, and I felt it more with every step. I made my way toward the small legal office downtown because I needed answers, and I needed them fast, and though my husband believed he had gained control of everything, when that inheritance arrived he forgot one simple truth: paperwork has a way of revealing everything. And as I walked into the quiet office, the receptionist greeted me and I felt myself straighten my back, because for the first time in a long time I was standing in a room not as someone's wife or someone's burden but as myself, and that alone brought a warmth to my chest. When I explained why I had come, the staff began gathering documents and files, and I sat there feeling my heart pound because I had no idea what I was going to discover, only that something deep inside me insisted there was more to this inheritance than what my husband had told me, and the longer I sat there the more I realized that life has a habit of hiding answers until we are strong enough to receive them, and I felt strong now, not unbreakable but steady enough to hear the truth. The lawyer called me into a small room, and as I stepped inside I felt the air grow thick because truth has weight, and I sensed that I was about to feel all of it at once, and when he opened the folder in front of him and looked at me, his face softened in a way that made my skin prickle, because softness is rarely the first sign of good news, it is usually the sign of something unexpected, something heavy, something that shifts everything you thought you knew. And as he began speaking I felt the ground beneath me shift slowly, then faster, like the earth was waking up to tell me something I had not been allowed to know until now. He explained that the inheritance my husband had shouted about, the inheritance that had made him push me off to the side, did not belong to him alone, because my father-in-law had written the will in a way that protected the family in case of betrayal or cruelty. And in that moment I felt my breath catch, because betrayal and cruelty were the very things I had lived with for so long, and now it seemed that fate, or maybe justice, had carved a space for me within that inheritance, a space my husband had tried to make me forget, a space he hoped I would never discover. And as the lawyer explained more I felt tears rise, but not the painful kind, the strong kind, the kind that come when a woman realizes she has more worth than she believed, the kind that come when life offers her a seat at a table she thought she had been pushed away from forever. I listened as the truth unfolded like a long quiet ribbon, and with each piece of information I felt myself grow taller, not in height but in spirit, because the money was not the real victory. The real victory was the revelation that my husband had not taken everything from me, he had not stripped me of my future, he had not erased my place in the world, and though he had kicked me out with cruel words thinking he stood at the top of a mountain built on gold, he did not know that the mountain was crumbling under his feet, because greed never builds strong foundations, it only builds illusions. When the meeting ended and I stepped outside, the sun felt warmer on my face and I took a deep breath, letting my lungs fill with air that tasted freer than anything I had breathed in years, and for the first time I felt the beginning of something new rising inside me. Something like courage, something like hope, something like the first step of a woman who had been pushed to the edge and now was ready to walk her way back to her own life. I walked down the street with a steadiness I had not felt in years, knowing that what my husband believed was his triumph was about to become the doorway to my own victory, because sometimes life lets a person fall just far enough to see the ground clearly, and once you see it clearly you know exactly where to plant your feet and how to rise again, stronger, wiser, and ready to claim what is yours, not with revenge but with dignity and a heart that has learned its true worth. And as the wind brushed my face I whispered to myself, you are not done, not by a long shot. The morning after everything had had happened, I woke with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and determination. The words my husband had shouted at me still echoed in my mind. "I don't need you anymore, I'm rich now." And for a brief moment I felt the weight of betrayal crush me, but then a spark ignited inside me, a quiet but fierce resolve that I would not allow myself to be reduced to helplessness or despair. I sat on the edge of the bed, taking slow, deliberate breaths, feeling the blood rush through my veins and realizing that the choice before me was simple: either succumb to fear and despair or rise and reclaim control of my life. I chose the latter. I began by assessing my immediate situation, where I was, what I had access to, and how I could protect myself. While planning my next steps, I went through my belongings carefully, evaluating each item and noting anything that could be useful. I realized that even though I had been forcibly removed from my home, I still carried knowledge, skills, and insight that my husband could never take from me. I reflected on the inheritance not just as money or property, but as a symbol of opportunity and the potential to rebuild my life independently without relying on anyone who sought to harm or dismiss me. After gathering my thoughts, I stepped outside and breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs and bring clarity to my mind. I walked through the streets, observing the world around me, noting resources, potential allies, and safe places. I realized that my awareness of my environment could be just as powerful a tool as any financial resource, and that careful observation would allow me to navigate the coming challenges with confidence and foresight. I considered the ways in which I could leverage the inheritance wisely to secure temporary accommodation, cover essential needs, and create a foundation for long-term stability. Throughout the day I began to take deliberate action, starting with establishing safe communication channels and contacting a few trusted friends who could provide guidance and support. I was cautious about what I shared and how I shared it, recognizing that discretion and strategy were crucial to maintaining safety and autonomy. I received advice and offers of practical help that reinforced my sense of empowerment and reminded me that even in moments of betrayal and loss, there are people willing to stand beside you if approached wisely. I realized that part of reclaiming control involved recognizing where to accept help and where to rely solely on my own resourcefulness. With these supports in mind, I turned my attention to the practical aspects of securing my independence. I opened a small portion of the inheritance account to cover immediate necessities, carefully budgeting each expenditure to ensure sustainability. I made lists of essential tasks, prioritized actions based on urgency, and created contingencies for potential obstacles. I felt a growing sense of mastery over my circumstances and a quiet thrill in realizing that my actions were shaping my future and restoring agency that had been stripped away by betrayal. I understood that empowerment often comes not from a single act of defiance, but from a series of deliberate and thoughtful decisions executed consistently. By midday I took time to reflect in a quiet park, observing children playing and couples walking by. I considered the emotional journey I had experienced: the shock, betrayal, fear, anger, and gradual awakening to personal strength and capability. I realized that the inheritance was not only financial but symbolic, representing a turning point, a moment where I could choose to define my own path and assert my independence. I allowed myself to feel pride in the resilience and strategic thinking I had cultivated, recognizing that surviving betrayal requires both emotional fortitude and practical intelligence. In the afternoon I explored potential long-term options for housing, employment, and legal protections. I visited offices, discreetly gathering information about resources available to women in situations like mine. I spoke calmly and assertively, presenting my circumstances without defensiveness or desperation. I noticed the way people responded to confidence and composure and realized that projecting assurance even in moments of uncertainty can create opportunities and garner respect. I documented details meticulously, noting contacts, potential benefits, and risks, and slowly a plan began to form in my mind, mapping a pathway toward sustainable independence and security. As evening approached, I returned to a temporary lodging place I had secured and began organizing my plans for the coming days. I created detailed lists of priorities, schedules for actions, and strategies for both anticipated and unexpected challenges. I reflected on the lessons learned about resourcefulness, observation, timing, and strategy. I realized that the betrayal I had experienced had forced me to develop skills and insights that would serve me far beyond the immediate crisis. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, understanding that independence is built step by step and that each thoughtful action reinforces the foundation of autonomy and confidence. I spent time journaling thoughts and reflections, noting emotional reactions, practical decisions and insights gained from the day. I considered how fear and anger had initially clouded judgment and how deliberate reflection and strategic planning had restored clarity and control. I realized that self-awareness and mindfulness are as important as any tangible resource in navigating adversity, and that cultivating these qualities strengthens resilience and improves decision-making. I felt a sense of gratitude for the clarity that action brings, for the lessons hidden within crisis, and for the potential to reclaim life on my own terms. Night fell and I took stock of the journey so far. The anger of betrayal had transformed into a quiet determination, the shock of displacement into practical strategy, the fear of uncertainty into awareness and careful planning. I realized that empowerment is iterative, cumulative and holistic, requiring the integration of courage, observation, resourcefulness, planning, reflection and selective reliance on trusted networks. I felt a profound sense of self-reliance, understanding that the inheritance was not merely money but a catalyst for reclaiming control over my life and a symbol of the personal power I had awakened. As I prepared to rest, I reviewed the steps I had taken and the lessons I had learned. I noted that each deliberate action taken with focus and courage compounded to create momentum that reinforced confidence and autonomy. I understood that the process of empowerment is dynamic and ongoing, that it is strengthened through repeated practice and reflection, and that it allows one to navigate crises not only effectively but with dignity and grace. I felt a deep sense of pride and anticipation, knowing that each decision I made built a stronger foundation for the life I intended to create. I laid down and allowed my mind to absorb the journey I had undertaken, the evolution from fear and betrayal to strategy and empowerment, the discovery of resilience and capability, the awakening of agency and confidence. I realized that key point 6 represents the culmination of courage, observation, resourcefulness, action and reflection, the full embrace of independence and the recognition that even after betrayal there is the capacity to reclaim life with strength, insight and dignity. It is the awareness that the trials endured have revealed personal power and the tools necessary to navigate both immediate and long-term challenges with confidence and clarity. Key point 6 concludes with the realization that empowerment is holistic and iterative, that true independence emerges from the integration of courage, resourcefulness, observation, strategic planning, reflection and selective reliance on supportive networks, that betrayal and loss can become catalysts for personal growth, and that reclaiming life after adversity requires deliberate, thoughtful action combined with emotional resilience and awareness, that through these steps survival transforms into strength and a foundation for lasting autonomy.